Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bruce Lewenstein. I'm the chair of the Department of Science and Technology Studies, and I'm really delighted to welcome you here to this conversation on technology and humanity, which is jointly sponsored by the STS department and by the Milstein program on technology and humanity. Before we start, I want to get the thank yous because we often don't quite get to those at the end. Particularly, I want to thank the Milstein program for helping fund this, as well as Robin Panavka, who is an alum of the College of Arts and Sciences, who's very interested in a bunch of these issues. I also want to thank the staffs of the department and of the program, particularly Maya Anderson, who's in the back, and Bailey Colvin from the STS department, who did a lot of the really hard work of actually making this this event happen. Now what I'd like to do is introduce Amy Villarejo, who's the director of the Milstein program, who will tell us a little bit about the program and then introduce our guest.
Super. So let me just add my welcome on behalf of the Milstein program and tell you just in a few words about what we're up to. Supported by a generous gift from two generations of Cornellians, Howard and Michael Milstein. The program aims to provide 100 students in the College of Arts and Sciences, the first 14 of whom are sitting right here, with a unique combination of a liberal arts degree here in Ithaca and 2 summers of study at our new Cornell Tech campus on Roosevelt Island. The conviction is that students in tech and STEM disciplines need broad understandings about who we are as humans and what values guide us. And in turn, students in the liberal arts need to understand tech deeply enough to be agents and not just users of its resources. So beyond educating this small cohort in the College of Arts and Sciences, the larger ambition of the Milstein program is to bring these kinds of conversations about technology and humanity to the campus at large. And so I'm extraordinarily pleased to share in this event today with our guest, Mitchell Baker. She is, as you likely know, the executive chairwoman of the Mozilla Foundation, where her title is actually Chief Lizard Wrangler. Mozilla is an open source nonprofit public benefit organization with paid employees and a core of volunteers. So she's less a corporate figurehead than the leader of a global virtual organization that also involves real people. Among its values are healthy communities, global communities, multiculturalism, diversity, tolerance, inclusion, empathy, collaboration, and technology for shared good and for social benefit. Her background includes a BA from UC Berkeley, and you'll be pleased to know it was in Asian Studies. And a year spent at Peking University in the very early years of China's opening to Western students. She trained as a lawyer with a law degree also from Bolt at UC Berkeley and worked for Sun Microsystems and then Netscape, overseeing issues of intellectual property and product development. Mozilla was spun from Netscape as an open source project, and she's been the leader at Mozilla since its inception. The list of honors bestowed upon her is way too long to recite, but include landing on a Time magazine list of the most influential people in the world. I would add that in the deck of cards of notable women in computing, she is a joker.
I didn't even ask.
Yeah. If you immerse yourself in her vision, as we will for a brief time today, you'll see that she's somebody who is able to embrace change, to argue passionately and eloquently for a humane and just future, and to imagine new paths for tech, education, and practice that will take us there. So please join me in welcoming Mitchell Baker to Cornell. And back to you, Bruce.
Great, thanks Amy, and welcome. So our goal today is to identify and explore a variety of topics at this intersection of technology and humanity, including questions about the relationship of technology and humanity, about the kinds of education particularly that we need to have if we're going to address that intersection, and then how we might be thinking about the future of technology and humanity. So So to begin, I'd like to ask a question sort of just about the relationship of technology and humanity. The crude way of asking that question is, what did we get right and what did we get wrong? But I actually want to use a slightly different version of it. There's a famous historian of technology, now deceased, named Mel Kranzberg, who listed 6 laws of technology. And the first law is technology is neither good nor bad nor neutral. How does that help us understand what went right and what went wrong?
What, you mean with the internet?
With the internet.
You know, I'm always an advocate of thinking back a little bit before the internet. Like, there's lots of technology in the world before the internet. And it's easy to forget that, and it's as basic as fire, you know, food, paper, you name it. So technology and the nature of society and our view of the world is inextricably linked. And so what human beings are capable of, what we think is possible in life, what we value in life, how we interact with each other, what society looks like is tightly related to technology. If you think of technology, or what are the capacities that we have as a species? I mean, our native capacities are pretty limited, you know, except for our big brain, you know, make stuff up and then build it. So I think that question of technology and humanity is probably too strong to say it's part of who we are, but in a social sense of what our societies are and what we as humans have built are fundamentally related. And I suspect that the network, today we use the internet, but network society, whether it's through the internet or through Facebook or through something else, I think is causing, but will continue to cause pretty deep changes about how we see the world, how do we think of time, how do we think about gratification. You know, lots of things are really quick now. I mean, if you have enough money, the idea that you can buy something from Amazon and it arrives tomorrow is crazy. It's a different set of time, it's a different set of expectations. Like, how you fulfill the things you want are just fundamentally different than 30, 40 years ago. And so I think we're actually really only at the beginning of that. So what did we get right and what did we get wrong? Well, we have new capabilities. I mean, I still love them. I still love the network, or the web, as we used to call it, which, you know, when the internet first came to consumers, right? It had been around in scientific communities, in universities for a while, with a command line interface. Right? So if you're used to editing a command line, you would imagine what it was like. But when it came to a general consumer and it had a graphical user interface that you as a human being could look at and click or punch or, you know, whatever, that was called the web. And sometimes we still call it the web because that embodies, I would say, our hopes for what it meant for society. And today, lots of people don't even know the phrase the web. And certainly if you come online somewhere in the world last year, the year before, or next year with a phone, a lot of people only hear Facebook. They don't hear the internet, but they certainly never hear the web, which for us was the concept in the early days of just maximum capability and possibility aimed at sort of positive, collaborative problem solving. So I think we got that right. It's a pretty powerful tool. But the tool has outpaced understanding of society or who we are and accountability and decency. You know, and it turns out, again, me as a layperson in my theories, but as a species, human beings without accountability don't do very well or for very long. If you take someone and you allow them to do whatever they want with zero accountability or treat people however you want, some percentage of us will behave with integrity and high standards for some period of time. But the general numbers of what we're willing to do and how we act when there's no accountability is pretty mixed. And so we have this very powerful system now where very few systems of accountability and a deep libertarian view of the world built into the first set of it. And so I think that's the biggest question, is we've got all of human nature online, and part of it's really nasty now, but we don't have understanding or accountability mechanisms, or even like the clues for self-control, right? If you find yourself someday, you know, having spent a lot of time on YouTube, like, turns out for a lot of people, you've been moving down a recommendation engine that's designed to keep you there and gets you into, you know, conspiracy theories or whatever it is. So now that we're learning that, but as humans, we don't have the tools, like, you know, like, what's happening, you know, so that's where I think we've got it.
So two interesting points about that. One is that by beginning your answer with looking back at history, that's Kranzberg's fifth law of technology, which is that all history is relevant, but the history of technology is the most relevant. But really what I want to do is pick up on that idea of decency and the values that we build into the technology. So you talk about it was built with libertarian kinds of values of openness and allowing, maybe I'm misquoting there. So the question is, you know, can we build decency into the technology?
Well, what I was really responding to is the identification of open with libertarian.
Okay.
So don't exactly want to make that connection. But I think one can build technology that has less addictive traits to it. Whether one can build it and be as profitable is unclear. And so the scope of answering that question, I think, is right into economics as well. But certainly in the early days, I think there wasn't much understanding. But I do think there are you know, UI labs that are really aimed at how do you keep people engaged. And in every one of those, there should be a conversation of, well, why is someone engaged? Right. Because addiction is a good way to keep people engaged, but it's personally unhealthy, and a society of addicts is not healthy either. And so we're just barely beginning. So I think we can do a lot better. But again, if you look outside of today's current tech and you look at food or pharma or cigarettes, like, these are all addictive things that we've decided are fine for society, or, you know, they may be bad, but individuals should have that choice. And so I suspect we'll make some similar decision, that there's technology out there that's addictive and harmful and dangerous, and may secondarily be dangerous for other people too, but it's okay. Like, where that line is, we don't know, but we've decided that with all sorts of things. Right. So I don't think that social media will be, like, radically different. If you were going to pick something to be radically different, maybe it should be food or drugs, or, you know, I don't know. But so I suspect each society will pick something different, and the tech will fall somewhere, you know, among the others, like sugar.
Right. So you were part of the beginning of the web, and I'd be eager to hear both about how your vantage point from the nonprofit world of the Mozilla Foundation allowed you a different sort of purchase or view of that trajectory, and what some of the values were that you saw at the early moments of trying to build this new thing.
Oh, well, that's really interesting, because when Mozilla started, it was not as a nonprofit. So we've been all over the place, and actually it's pretty warm here. So Mozilla started inside. So when the internet came to consumers, it was called the World Wide Web, and it came through one company only called Netscape, and it came through a browser. And until the phones, the only way, other than the command line interface, the only way you access the internet was through a browser. It's hard to imagine today when you use a million different apps for different things. But in the first generation, there was one tool, it was universal, and it was the browser. So if you were engaged in the browser, you were automatically engaged in every single connection a human being made with any content on the internet. And that's why we liked it, is it's an immense place to bring individual empowerment and some openness and liberty and you know, a range of choice to a human being. So we could see that even in a commercial setting.
Yeah.
You could see that this particular tool was powerful. You know, and in those days people bought software. It costs $99. Like, your access. The old way of free software came through, in those days it was Microsoft just putting everything in their product, and taking the money for themselves and killing everyone else. So that was the first. I mean, it was even illegal. Even the U.S. Supreme Court decided it was an antitrust violation and it was illegal, particularly over the way they drove Netscape into the ground. So we could see that. We were in the middle of it. Netscape had, not 100% market share, because there literally was no other way to access the internet as a normal human being. And then Microsoft did a bunch of things. Oh, we're in the Microsoft building. Go Bill! But they did a bunch of things, and they built a good product. They turned a giant company around, hard to do, built a good product eventually, and engaged in illegal activities. And that combination was successful. So we could see, as Netscape market share declined, we could see what was happening, which was a monoculture, right? Where everything, if you imagine the richness of the internet of that era, went through the Microsoft business plan. Yes. And so we could see, because we were in the industry, and we could see the decline, we could see all the innovation that was happening, usually on the server side or the back end, and how it was all limited by the front end, which was the browser. So you would have new file formats, for example, or new capabilities that a human being could never see because it didn't fit into Microsoft's business. And so it was very clear that the entire internet, I mean, this sounds like I'm exaggerating, but it's actually, not. The entire internet and how it developed would be determined by one company and this silly little product called the browser. So at that point, we knew that something had to be done. Yeah. And Netscape was a commercial company. I think it was still filled with a lot of idealism about, wow, the internet, you guys first encountered the internet when you were very young, but if you ever met an adult, the first time who encounters the internet as an adult, it's jaw-dropping. It's just, people are, astonished when you see that the first time. And so we had been living and, more and more people seeing that, and then you could see how it was being closed off and that it would be extremely limited. So the Mozilla piece came about of, no, this has to be, it has to have more competition, it has to have more choice. You can't have all the innovation being funneled through one business plan. And at the same time, the Netscape business was dying. And so the playing field, change the game was to become open source. Yeah. And to try and make a public asset. Yeah. And in those days, at that point, it was really impossible to compete with Microsoft as a single company. So the idea was, well, let's adopt this open source thing, and then lots of companies mostly can help create this product, and lots of companies will use it. In those days, open source was radical. So there was no open government, there was no open data, there was no open journalism, there was no open science, there was no open architecture, there was no whatever it is, it just did not exist. It was the end of a period of massive sort of corporate concentration and specialization and claiming ownership of everything that you could. So the idea that you would share anything was radical. Your businesses didn't do it. In fact, Microsoft again claimed it was un-American, and set out in their own memos, you can read, to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt about open source, being unsafe, insecure, un-American, bad, just a bad thing. So that turned out in a way to be good for us because it's very useful. I mean, there was no GitHub. I mean, the idea of anything like that was totally crazy. And so we adopted, an open source model where your code is open, people can see it, your bugs, your development process. I mean, you can still follow any development process you want. Later, Apple picked up open source. Obviously, Google picked it up from Chrome. So it was a really radical change, which was good for us. And we were, we weren't actually the crazy hippie communists in California basement somewhere that people thought we were. Yeah. We're, one thing I like about technology and product and the market is it drives you into reality. You can't be very extreme, or it's hard to build a piece of technology if you're just not paying attention to people. So we ended up with this open source piece, which in its era carried a very strong set of values with it. I think it's kind of become successful enough. It's in the consumer mainstream now, and you need a library, you go find it, you drop your stuff on GitHub. It's just kind of the way things are. But each open source project has its own terms of service. All they're called licenses because they're copyright licenses, and we explicitly would refer to them as your constitution. And we would go back and forth about, Apache or Berkeley's or MIT's or the Mozilla one or the GPL and what kind of community and society are you trying to create? And how is it that your developers interact with each other? What is leadership? Who has authority? If a big corporate entity wants to use it, how do they participate? And so it was an extremely value-based change to go from the closed proprietary to the open source.
Yes.
And I would say that's the set of values that we carry with us. And we think the internet protocol, the actual IP protocol that distributes packets, but like that if you talk to the creators of it, had a set of values attached to it. And the protocols that Tim used when he made the World Wide Web, HTTP, HTTPS, / like that protocol and the way that it works was explicitly designed with values in it. Distributed, opportunity, no need for permission, bunch of things in there. And we have tried to, incorporate as many of those values as we can into Mozilla products, but also into how we operate. So that's a long answer, I guess.
Okay. So I'm intrigued by one of the comments you just made. You made as you started that about these global values or a global open set of values that are built into the internet, but you also talk about each society being different.
Yeah.
So that there's a conflict there between societies making their own choices. American values are different than European values or UK values and Spanish values. Never mind Africa and Latin America and all countries around the world. How do we think about that tension between the need for individual societies to have some control over their own culture when it is connected to this global open resource?
Yeah. Well, there's probably no perfect answer. The one thing is, what is the foundation? What are the capabilities of the actual foundational technology, and what's the content and human experience? So, for example, I would say that the values that were built in. So one of them was literally a single nuclear attack cannot take out the network, right? So it's distributed. There's one reason that the internet started out with no centralized point is because it came out of the U.S. Department of Defense in an advanced research project funded by the U.S. government. And so one of the criteria was it needs to be robust and survivable in the case of, in those days, it was nuclear attacks that were the piece. So that's a value which may or may not translate directly into society. Like we try to when we build things, but doesn't necessarily have to. So one is there are some pieces, and even the distribution of packets in a way that's robust within an approved system is adopted globally, and that's not where the issues are. So as you go further up the stack, into content and human experience, that's where you tend to get into those things. And that's a question we really truly haven't answered. My own view, I'm not advocating for it, but I won't be surprised if the internet fragments even more. Not just, people like to point to, the China, the internet, and the PRC, but like Facebook is its own little internet. Things go in, but if you want to see something, you need to be in there. I mean, the ideal of something that's really, truly global and universal, I think we're not living it now. So that's not a clear answer to your question, but I think we're going to have more options.
So one language that sometimes gets used is to talk about the internet as a bunch of neighborhoods. The neighborhood most people think of it as geographically,
right.
But what you're suggesting is a distributed set of neighborhoods. You might be in the Facebook neighborhood, you might be in the closed corporate neighborhood.
You might live in Instagram, wherever it is. So, well, the thing that breaks down there is that, in neighborhoods, you hope or think you have some influence or impact over the quality or traits of those neighborhoods. Right. Like not everyone does, but often a goal is if you live in a community, you have some impact on it. Like, what's acceptable out on the street? If something terrible is happening out on the street, is anybody going to go out and help? Right. If you're the unlucky person that gets selected to, be abused or beat up, like, is anybody going to help you? Like that, you judge and you try and either pick the neighborhood or improve it, or do something in those things, and that's very hard in the current platform piece. Right, I think it was probably part of the original unstated, like what's really exciting would be that you could do those things, but it hasn't lacking of control mechanisms.
And you talked about these explicit conversations about the Constitution, about Apache, MIT, Berkeley license, whatever.
Yeah.
Does that happen? Is that happening now? Are there conversations about the human experience, about what are these choices we're making as we make these design choices?
Well, I think they're very different. So that piece about a community voluntarily forming together and picking a constitution it chooses to live under, those I think have faded. Right. Like in the open source and free software world, we found a way to live together and be compatible. We finally stopped fighting. Mine is better than yours. But to say, look, we're all in the same zone. So how do we, tweak the legal system so that we can work together on those? But the discussion now is much more about. It's not framed the same way, at least as I hear it. I hear, part of the internet is broken. What do we do? Or what do we do about the platforms? Or how do we regulate the platforms? Or the platforms should control bad content. Or no, they shouldn't. So it's very much about them. Like there's the big thing out there, the big centralized authority control figure, the platform. And very, very little about, is it actually possible to form some kind of more voluntary human community / society that has some control and some structural tools to build a neighborhood.
Has that been part of the way that you've been thinking about India? About, what constitutes a body or a private part of the body in the context of regulation, in the context of challenging some of those
Are you thinking of the India identity?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So India has implemented with the funding and engagement of the World Bank as an IT for Development program, a digital identity system which has a bunch of biometric information in it. Which of course is a problem because you can't, once it's hacked, you can't get a new retina. You can't just change your fingerprints or your retina scans. So you phrased that in an interesting way about concepts about the body and what's private about the body, and I think that's a perhaps new way of approaching it. We've been much more focused on what does secure technology actually look and feel like. Because that system is broad enough and designed, it's got so many actors in it that the attack surface for just a pure security, penetration analysis, any of these things is immense. And the claim is no, the core is fine. The core that's got all your biometric info in it is fine. Yeah.
Right.
And it's a system, so it's one of these where the question gets framed like tech is something new. This new tech is new and different, and there's no balance. So maybe I'll go back to your first question for a moment. What's one of the things I think we're getting wrong is this focus on the network as the only technology that we've ever looked at, and that the balances we've constructed to date aren't relevant. So, in a democratic society, we have some set of balances about public benefit, which can be extremely coercive, and individual liberty. And, the U.S. is different than England, is different than France, is different than Japan, is different than India. They're all different, but they're all on one part of the spectrum. And today, I think that's kind of going out the window in we must stop X and it has to be perfect. And so the, what's it called? ICT for D, right? ICT for development processes, they will ask questions like, well, we're trying to get state benefits, to people living at the very bottom of the pyramid.
Yeah.
And we have to do that, so all the digital identity stuff makes sense. Like that. Well, first of all, like, having a digital identity is not the magic bullet, right? The fact that you've got fraud, you're going to have fraud again. The fact that you've missed people, you're going to miss people again. Now you're going to miss people because you think they're dead, but they're still alive, and there's no way to fix it, right? There's a bunch of problems in there, and you can't just say X justifies anything.
Yes.
And this is something that as a society, when it comes to modern network technology, we haven't learned how to do yet. And it's like Facebook did it. Connecting people at all cost, right? Like internal mantra. Doesn't matter, like maybe it's not really the greatest behavior, but connecting people at all costs is always worth it, always good, always justified. Digital identity at all costs is always justified because the ultimate goal is a public benefit and health, and so those balances, I think we're getting wrong right now.
I asked the question about the body in part because it seems to me that there are resources in different areas of conversation that are helpful for thinking about technology other than in regulatory or ethical schemes. And one of those, for example, is the idea of data sovereignty, which I think is a very powerful idea that has to do with some notion of who we are and what our boundedness is and what intimacy is. Yeah, or some relationality to ourselves, that is interesting. And that proposes different ways of thinking than a kind of ethical evaluation of professional behavior, which I think is limited. So the body to me is an interesting part of that in terms of intimacy and privacy and relationships to ourselves.
That's really interesting. Well, I too am concerned that the ethical framework, if overused, would end up calling for this is ethical and this is unethical.
Right.
And first of all, it's very hard to work with people if you're telling them they're unethical. And in a product sense, in a life with trade-offs, it's hard to say exactly what's ethical. After the fact, something that's unethical is pretty easy to see. I mean, there are some things that look really unethical as behaviors that are easy, but in the question of how do you build a product, and if people really want something that's convenient and it's insecure, but they won't use the secure one, and you take something that's insecure because it's the only thing people will choose, and you try and add a little bit to it, like, is that ethical? Is trying to move the ball forward ethical, or should you, I think it's a very useful framework, and I like the questions of the broader sense in which ethics is being used. What are the values behind it? Do we think about them? We need that so badly.
Yes.
And I think the jump to say that's unethical, and you won't do unethical things, or you'll build an ethical product, which at a sort of aspirational sense I would sign on to, but as someone who's been trying to build product for so long, like as a nonprofit that wants to do exactly that, there's still hard questions.
So some of this leads to the question of what people need to know, or what education should we be doing in order to help have people developing these things, so that our students here are, what is it that we need to. We can't just add an ethics course. Right?
Yeah.
There's something else that's needed. What is that? What is that other thing, or other things?
Yeah. Well, you can't add an ethics course, and it's not. I think a lot depends on whether the use of the word ethics, as in this very broad sense, continues, or whether because it's ethics, it ends up being narrow. Like biomedical ethics are a precise thing, legal ethics are extremely narrow. So But I do think there is an enhanced piece of what is the interaction between technology and humanity. And so clearly, understanding the human brain, I mean, what we understand about humans and building patterns in the brain and what happens to people, and how we process information, that's a field that's rich and growing all the time. So you can imagine whether is it addiction, is it like some understanding of humanity. But I'm not a believer in adding tons of humanities courses into a STEM education either. I think they have to be integrated. And increasingly, when you get into problem solving of large scale problems, it's not done individually so much. It's a much more collaborative work, and often now different labs working together. Not only different people in a lab, but different labs bringing their different specialties to it. So we are in a world where that sort of interdisciplinary, different perspective teams is growing or necessary. And so I think the enhancing of the STEM piece to include something of humanity is also good to think about at a team level. Like not every individual, you just can't add years worth of studies to a degree. So
what level does this have to happen at? That is, should this be happening in kindergarten? Should this be happening in middle school? Is this college? Yes.
I mean, it's clear that at all levels of humanity, we have not reached much decency or understanding even of ourselves, let alone in social settings, of how to bring this new network technology. And if you're trying to adjust behavior, we do, is it shaming? How vicious are you? I mean, all of these things. So, and I think, you often build patterns early in life.
Yeah, I was going to say we should open this up to questions in the audience. So we're starting to see people. Yeah, go ahead. And I'm going to repeat the question just so everybody can hear it.
Okay. So I thought about this about 20 minutes ago when you were talking about Netscape and how Microsoft with Internet Explorer kind of took over the entire internet standards and started dictating what they decided should be there and shouldn't be there. That has evidently improved in the last 10 years or so with, Firefox, and everyone at least used to make their own browsers. There's Safari now and there's Chrome. But with the rise of Chromium and so many of these companies switching what used to be independent browsers like Opera into using the Chromium engine and Google gaining more and more power, do you see a risk of one company beginning to dictate internet standards again? And if so, how do you propose we avoid that dark future?
So for those in the back who might not have been able to hear, the question is, it looks like we have lots of browsers, but if a lot of them are built on the same engine, do we really? And if so, what is the implication?
Right. I think the natural default is that Google controls almost everything for your generation. That's the natural default. That's why Mozilla is there. What we've begun to see in the last 18 months is we fixed our product, which is important, have the technical crown again. That's always helpful when the techies are like, this is the right product, and feels great, I have to say. But is not enough to make a mass consumer change, because Chromium is still good enough for most things. But we have begun to see some signs of change. So what we continue to do is we continue to actually try and build the best product and to try to reach people. And to begin, it turns out there are a bunch of companies that are really uncomfortable. Like they've seen this movie before. And so, a range of those things plus a set of products. I don't know that anyone else is going to come along and make a change. Like sometimes you hope there's a real technology change or something else changes the market. But because so much momentum is in the phone and apps right now, and the cost and investment to an actual independent browser is really expensive. I think that if Firefox isn't it, like it's Chromium for a good while, probably until there's some technical change. Or, you know, products tend to deteriorate when there's no competition. That's what happened to Microsoft. So, sorry, Mike. You know, we do also look at, you know, a lot of apps are mostly web technology, but wrapped in a little proprietary wrapper that Apple and Google require, and that's beginning to change. And how much of that technology can we actually use for apps so that the technology is useful to a broader set of people, and you can build a different developer ecosystem around it. So that's the current and newer piece of those things. And of course, you know, the chance that there's another phone in these markets is really low too. Right, so that's the bad news. Maybe it would be okay if Google owned the desktop browser if they didn't actually own whatever percentage of the world's internet mobile traffic. You know, they also fun, cheerful. Yeah, it's a long fight. But we are actually trying to get to the people who know and care, and, you know, with a product that's
in the dark jacket back there. Yeah.
So this is a more, I guess, abstract question, but besides Mozilla and a nonprofit, what sort of institution do you think could, on a larger scale, inspire these sorts of values that we've been talking about in technology development?
Well, you asked institution, which is where my first response is a much more social or community-based response. The institution piece, these kinds of values.
Do we need to create institutions?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting piece. Institutions that promote values in something. There is a set of, I'll call them allies. You know, in my language, I would say open internet activists, but open internet doesn't have the meaning today that it used to. So I'll call them allies for value and socially beneficial technologies, right? There are a set of organizations that do that. I think all of which have trouble reaching the mainstream consumer base or providing realistic steps to take or solutions or ways to participate in pushing the system to a better place. So that's why I'm struggling to say what the other institutions ought to be and whether it comes from institutions.
Just want to probe some more. So
Good question.
yeah, I mean, so the Mozilla Foundation has these values goals, the Mozilla Manifesto.
Yes.
But Mozilla, the corporation, the subsidiary that you've mentioned several times, its goal is to produce product.
No, actually, we are very unusual in the nonprofit space.
Okay.
We have a subsidiary, pays taxes. The IRS does not believe open source software or public benefits are public assets. Right? And they think that open source software is useful for business, and therefore just producing open source software, even as a nonprofit, where the public has an interest in it, is not legitimate purpose for the IRS in most cases.
Okay.
Right? Like, it's brutal.
Yes.
It's brutal, right? Like, it's not that I compete with Google because it's like all fun and glory and like I love making less money. You know, I don't do it for that reason. I do it because it's important socially. But the governing institution, the IRS, like has a different view. So that's there we go. Like there we go. So part one. Let's see what we could do. Whether maybe there's another institution that ought to figure out: is this a commons? Is this good for the public besides the tax authority? So that would be helpful, actually. So that's a good idea to come out of this. Yeah. But we have this thing that pays taxes. So technically, it's a taxable organization, and sometimes people think it's for profit. But that's not how we run it. Right. We run it because product is such a powerful tool to achieve the mission. Like we can talk all day about security, but if I put in front of you product X and it's a good product and you like it and it's more secure, and then you build a market share that shows consumers actually will make a choice for something better, then you can actually move the market. So that's why we're drawn to it.
Yeah.
On the topic of ethics, do you think what is ethical and what is not is defined by the laws of each individual country? Or do you think there should be a universal set of behavior that's considered ethical or not?
Everybody here shall repeat.
Well, that's probably a question. Actually, I would say that's a phenomenal example of why other forms of learning and study, like there's a lot of sociological and anthropological and probably psychological understanding that would go into a good answer, right? Because my first answer was to say, like from my understanding and in human culture, there are generally, we share some set of things that most cultures don't permit. But sometimes that can be really narrow. And so I think the question of, like, is there a global standard for ethics? Probably needs more data than I have to actually be able to answer. So I think that suggests, maybe that's why I think that ethics might end up narrow, because if you're going to legislate, like by law, like lots of times you might look at something and say, well, that's legal, but it feels unethical to me. Like, I don't know, like, well, anyway. Maybe I won't give examples, but, so I would imagine that, like, in terms of a legal standard, whether it's global or national or regional, and encompasses different perspectives, I think ideally it's probably narrower legally than culturally what you think you want.
In the back there? Yeah. Yeah.
If there's one thing that Mozilla has taught us, it seems to be that people working together and organizing their goodwill can affect massive change. Where do you think that change should be aimed at now?
I would aim it at understanding and developing alternatives to the technology that drives outrage, anger, and violence, and lack of rational thought. That fear, outrage response, because I think that affects everything. And the ability to manipulate a system to drive that in whole populations. It's hard to see solving other huge problems until we can figure those out. Wow, new strategy for Mozilla. No, I'm serious. Like these are some of the questions of, like, where's the greatest need? And
We got one back there and then one up here. Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. So you mentioned DARPA as kind of the genesis of all of this, and it seems like in recent years there's a little more stigma to accepting military funding. If Google and Project Maven is any indication, I'm curious what your thoughts are on whether there's any ethical taboo against accepting defense dollars, and what you think the ethics are on that.
yeah, I'll just step back for one moment and say very often I hear these comments about government, like government can't do anything right and government's never invented anything. Wait a minute, internet, So I think some of these questions come up in the context of the employee base and the culture, it's interesting to me, like if you work at Boeing or you work at a place that manufactures aircraft and some of those are sold to the military, is that an unethical business? And I feel almost like we should answer the question about the military as a society. If your society has a military, like why is that, and how? What do you think about that? And that is more of the question than whether a particular industry is good or bad at it. I think we're focusing on tech because, you know, the capabilities you can add right now, you know, we're at this phase where you can add these massive new capabilities to military weapons. And so it's a fine point to be discussing it. Would you say that the US shouldn't have any military at all? You know, or if some people might answer yes, but if you answer no, I think we should have some, like what is it and where and what's ethical or not. And so, you know, I think what you start to see is a set of employees saying, that's not what I thought I was coming here for. And that's not what I want to be working on. And that's not the promise that you gave me. And so those things should change, which I think are triggers of the larger question of what do we think about it? I mean, I don't know if it's worse to use AI in your bombing patterns than it is to not use AI in your bombing patterns if you're like having the same result. Like, I don't know. So I think this is another question where the power of the tech today like kind of subsumes, eats everything. You know that famous phrase, software eats everything, came out of the founder of Netscape, software eats everything. But I think that these capacities and questions about the new technology are eating like larger social and ethical and moral questions.
Jonathan and yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, you know, has to do with the fact that I'm a biologist, and I have a pretty different understanding of what a biological organism is than most people seem to. And what's interesting about that is that, you know, there are people who have, you know, a very genetic determinist understanding of what organisms do and why they exist and how they come into being. And that enables them to think about, they want to download themselves onto the internet because all they are really is a brain and stuff. And that, you know, in my personal opinion, that view of an organism is completely wrong. And what you have, you know, what a lot of our discussion is predicated on that understanding. And, you know, you have, for example, which goes back to the question just now about a universal ethics, is that indigenous people, for example, have a view that would be similar to mine, right? It's a very, very different understanding of what an organism is. Mm-hmm. And so you have, you know, essentially there's a lot of discussion in our society about what, you know, STEM and, you know, interactions between humans and robots and humans and the internet and so on and so forth. But they are, you know, in my opinion, there is no good biological description of what an organism really is. And that biologists have basically shrunk away from a whole discussion about that. And so I feel like we're going to have a struggle to have this conversation, you know, as a society. If we buy into the sort of orthodox standard view of an organism, we're going to have a lot of disconnects when we try to you know, use that to develop a curriculum, for example, you know, which is the premise of our discussion today, because it's all based on certain ideas of what organisms are and why they exist and what their purposes are and so forth.
It's probably true of all education, right? All curriculum. I mean, I think your critique would apply to pretty much broader than this particular topic, right? Like how do you teach what is human?
Yeah.
Well, then we don't have to. Fortunately, like the educational system as a whole should be addressing that, and maybe we can not have to solve that one now from ground zero. I know, but I'm serious. Like if the educational system were addressing that, it would probably be a good enrichment to the specific aspect of education.
Just going off what you were saying about the IRS, like it's become pretty clear in recent years that like technological literacy in the government isn't really where it needs to be in terms of like policy making and stuff. So like, what's the best way to address that? Like, do we educate the policymakers who are already there? Do we just have to wait for younger people to get elected? Like, do we just kind of leave it all to the private sector? Like, what's the best way to address that?
Yeah. I think would be to look for policymakers that have a technical staff and educate them. Because the staffers do a lot of the work and the briefing. And if you have a policymaker that, so I think that the long-term answer is that it's hard to educate sitting legislators. Partly because they have a huge range of things that they're not expert on. Like most things, because most of us are not experts on more than just a couple of things. And so typically what you find is they want the quick understanding of the issue in front of them when it's exactly in front of them. And that's, it's hard to get the foundations at that point. I mean, they have a very specific need and that's what they want to know. And so I think with the staffers you have a better chance, and then I think, yes, there is an election piece of who's more savvy. Or at least aware that they're not savvy and, you know, willing to listen to someone, but in terms of educating, for a lot of the sitting legislators and good staff. Like some things it doesn't matter, like net neutrality, Americans are something like, I don't know, 73% in favor of net neutrality. But, so like even voting with what your constituency wants is not enough. Right, so some things I think, yes, the only answer is some different set of people. But a more short term, there's a set of people on some specific set of issues where you can educate staffers. And if you're interested, you know, there's a bunch of lobbying or educational organizations that might help with how to do that. And the last piece would be if you really want to get engaged, the ally organization called the Electronic Frontier Foundation is actively looking for people with technical knowledge to help them. Now they litigate more than engage in legislation, but that means we've already got a law in front of us that's really bad. And so they are actively seeking people to do the review and analysis and help them be smart enough. And so they will also have a set of who's ready to learn.
And we will have a congressional election right here in 2020. One candidate of which is a real expert in the digital divide and net neutrality. And
our local candidate.
Yes, exactly. So it'd be an opportunity to get to know some of those issues intimately.
Yeah, so I just had a more general question. You have a background in law, so I was just curious about what you thought about like the relationship between law and the internet. From what I understand, it took the government a long time to kind of figure out that the internet was a thing, that they probably should make laws about it. Like the MCA and like COPA took like quite a while after like DARPA pulled out.
I know,
like,
too bad it hadn't taken longer.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding, not with the MCA,
Yeah.
but with the laws were, you know, so
It's like, what do you think of like how the law and the internet like interact today? Like, is the law still playing catch up? Like, are we always going to be in catch up mode forever? Like,
I think it's going to be in catch up mode for a while because the pace of change is so fast, and it's you know, especially in the U.S. system, which is precedent and case law based until you get legislation. It's always it's not the actual law. Well, the case law side of it is always backward looking, right? It's not a set out what you want things to be, it's a decide problems. And then the legislative piece, well, you know, I think the legislative pace might pick up right now, that everybody's frustrated with the big platforms, and so the, you know, typical Democratic-Republican divide doesn't seem to exist right now. But it does take a while. I think, you know, back in Netscape, I don't know if we were the first people to define a website or what a web page was in a legal contract, but if we weren't the first, we couldn't find any. So we made them up, like tried to describe in legal terms what these things are. And so it takes a long time for that kind of stuff to work its way through the system, let alone into a law. So I think we're going to see more legislation, but I don't know if it'll be good. Coming out of the so-called techlash. And I will say the Obama administration had a lot of people looking at tech policy in a pretty proactive way. There's a lot of criticism that so many of them were from Google that kind of regular, capture by friendlies, which I'm still thinking about that one. So I'm not quite sure of my opinion on that, but I know a lot of people feel that way. But even if that's true, in the CTO's office and the deputy CTOs, I know a bunch of them. And they were really actively focused on, okay, so what do drones mean? How do we think about drones? What does automated cars mean? How do we actually think about it? Are we promoting them? What are the risks? Should we be legislating? Should we be encouraging? Should we be working with these companies so that there's a level playing field for all the different automated car companies? How do you get good stuff out of them? So in that period, there was in the U.S. a real significant focus on trying to, if not actually regulate it, at least get the early regulations or start to engage in what regulations might look like, that not legislative Congress stuff, but the administrative, executive, legislative part, which is a little more flexible sometimes. So that there was a pretty good sized effort on that, and a huge effort to build the USDS, the US Digital Service, which was built by the guy who, after the healthcare.gov fiasco, and they got some good services folks into the White House and made a CTO role. And he was really adamant and a phenomenal recruiter. I mean, I've got friends who won't get near him because they don't want to be recruited. He's not in government now, right? He was in the Obama era. But they really did build a digital service that had pride, and it was partly employees, but they were also building a program for technologists to come in for 3 months or 6 months, or you could get a sabbatical from your job, or you're in between jobs, or you made some money, or whatever it is, and you can take time off. So that was a model of trying to get ahead of it. So those things are possible, but I don't think that's happening now.
So this has been a great discussion. We are getting near the time. Amy, do you have any?
I'd just like to invite people to the reception, and we can continue the conversation informally, and to thank Mitchell especially for her time. Would you join me in thanking Mitchell for joining us? So,
And please do join us in the reception right outside.
lovely.